Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Practically Platonic. Hi, Sylvia.
Hi, how are you doing?
Good, good, good. So now we have reached book 2, and we're looking at chapter 1, which is Plotinus discussing cosmology as he understood it. Now, to jump right in, I want to quote from section 2.1.5. And he says, he presents the question, how then do the heavenly bodies or heavenly parts persist, while the sublunary elements and living beings do not persist? In fact, Plato says that the former have come to be from God, but the sublunary living beings from the gods generated from that God, as it is unlawful for things that came to be from that God to be destroyed. And then he goes on to say, this amounts to saying that the heavenly soul comes next after the demiurge, and our souls too, and that a reflection of the soul of the universe goes out from it and flows out in a way from the higher beings and creates the living beings on earth. So this is basically the fundamental cosmology of Neoplatonism, where you have a division in the world, the visible world, between the sublunar and the superlunar. So there is that which is below the moon, which is, for all intents and purposes, our material world as we experience it on planet Earth. And then there is the superlunar, which is the realm of heavenly bodies, which is still part of the material world, and it's visible because we can see it. But the sort of makeup of that cosmology or makeup of the cosmos is fundamentally different between the superlunar and the sublunar. So as he goes on to say in this chapter, there's a difference primarily in the continuity of material entities. So for example, as he saw it anyways, the movements of the stars were consistent and eternal. And that is different from the material world where things are constantly in flux, where the elements as we experience them are also dependent on other things. So for example, fire is dependent on fuel. Without fuel, you can't have fire. And the same thing with our bodies too, is that we're subject to all sorts of nourishment, as he would call it, things external to our material makeup that we require just to continue our existence. Whereas from his perspective, at his time, looking up at the stars, you could see the consistent, predictable movements of the planets, which were perfectly ordered. And as he saw it too, things like the sun and the stars were basically eternal light, that they didn't require additional inputs or nourishment in order for their existence to persist. And so there's a very strong, line that's drawn between these two. And so going back to this quote that he has of Plato, that at the level of the superlunar realm, that is created by the gods, which by extension are basically creations of the demiurge. So demiurge in Plato is the figure in Timaeus who forms and creates the universe like an artisan or blacksmith or a craftsman. And so that area of material reality is perfectly ordered and eternal, whereas ours is not. And he also says, how could it persist if these did not similarly persist? For the sublunary bodies are no longer parts of heaven, otherwise heaven would not extend only as far as the moon. So we're basically in an inferior material state. And then this sort of discussion extends into the nature of the elements at both at this superlunar realm and the sublunar realm. And so he has to have this extended discussion about why is it that some things at the superlunar are eternal and some things and everything at our level is not eternal. So what's your thoughts on this, Sylvia?
My thoughts were that he's clearly wrong about the nature of the superlunar spheres, or the planets and other bodies that are in space. That's to be understood as not, considering the era he was living in, and he was just going off of what the previous philosophies on the nature of cosmology were, and his own observations and anecdotal observations. And we have to remember what the perception of the planets were at that time as these kind of materially manifested divine beings, right? As representations of or expressions of different divinities. So that makes sense. And I suppose the reason that even though, and we'll get to this in a moment, what he thinks what can be eternal and what is not eternal. Obviously, us and things here on Earth are not eternal, but he says that he thinks that the planets and the stars are eternal. I assume he thinks this because they, being divine and being created by the demiurge or the one, they're imbued with a level of divinity which they are divine or have a level of divinity which we do not. Therefore, they don't need any, as he calls it, external nourishment. They're kind of like perfect and whole on their own, to use a different term. And that's why they're able to persist without. Now, obviously, we know, or at least I guess you could make the argument that, you and I haven't actually gone up to space. You and I, at least as far as I know, don't have, or very few people on this planet allegedly have a real understanding of the level of physics that is needed to be understood to really know whether or not, and mathematics, to really know whether or not what we're being told is true or not, right? But let's take for a given that most of what we're being told is factually correct and empirically proven by modern science is true. By that, he's obviously incorrect on the actual nature of the planets and the suns, the stars. We know that in reality, our sun, other stars, they're created. They do actually have something that fuels them, and that or in originality, that they were not always there since forever. They were formed at some point, and they will either implode or explode, or something will happen to them where they will eventually die, even though he was not aware of this. And the length of the life of a star is almost eternal by human standards. And obviously the other planets are not actually, they are elementally different from Earth, but not to such an extent that they're that different. And they've been created, they're influenced and affected by external factors such as asteroids, comets, and the elements that make up their own atmosphere eventually will, and the fact that they are dependent, just like the Earth is, on the nourishment of the sun. And another thing which he obviously didn't really have an understanding of is the centripetal force of gravity and the nature of solar systems. But beyond all that, what I thought was more interesting, which he gets into and is kind of one of the main points beyond kind of this setting up of the order of the physical and the I guess the profane material and the divine material, in a sense, right? Is the other thing he brings up is what makes something eternal and what makes something, I guess, mortal or finite. And he presents the idea that, as we just said, the planets are eternal, but he makes a more compelling argument for the universe being eternal, because he says it does not rely on anything external to it to nourish itself. He basically says there's nothing outside of the universe, and we're to understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the universe is the material manifestation, the material emanation of the intelligible forms, the soul, the one. So really, in a sense, outside of all of these things, to include the material realm, which is the universe, there's nothing. In a true sense, in a metaphysical sense, in a mathematical sense. He doesn't get into that much detail. He just kind of sets it up as a given on, things internal to it change. There's flux internally to it, but there's no external flux because there's nothing outside of it. And this I thought was quite compelling and interesting because when I went back to kind of brush up on at least what in mainstream astrophysics and theoretical physics, what some of the main ideas are about, one, the nature of the universe insofar as its form and whether or not it is eternal or not. One, we've come up with, obviously we have way more tools than he did, and we have way more theories, but at the end of the day, we don't actually, and they themselves, we don't actually know any more about the true nature of the universe than Plotinus did. But some of the hypotheses that are most backed, I guess, is the idea that, there's the idea that perhaps the universe, in a sense, is eternal, whether that's because we will go through a cyclical big crunch, or even the idea of like that there should be like a the slow cooling or the big chill, I think they call it. But also after that, then what? They don't really, at least the different literature and some of the available journals I was able to look at, it doesn't really expound on, okay, once there's a big chill, then what happens? It seems that there is an idea that it might, retract. But beyond that, the idea that it seems more consistent that there is the idea that there is nothing outside of the universe, and different ideas of like what the actual shape of the universe is. This, if I remember correctly, the idea that what they have used to try to figure out how quickly the universe is expanding is obviously by looking at how quickly galaxies or stars are moving away from each other, but also looking at, what was it called? I don't remember, but they measure a curvature, and based on the curvature, they're able to, I guess whether based on this hypothesis of the curvature, they think whether or not the universe is circular, flat, or what. And I guess the curve is flat, and therefore, because of its flatness, it's like infinite, and that it's like there's nothing outside of it. They try to explain it as if you were to be in a two-dimensional, like flat on a balloon, and the balloon continues to expand, and you're a tiny little insect or a microscopic insect. Even though this balloon keeps expanding, you're really just on the surface of it. There's no depth to it, and even if you were to walk all the way around it, you would eventually get to the same place. And a lot of the idea of like, well, how can it be expanding into nothing? At that point, it starts to get weird, and they come up with what they call sophisticated mathematics to explain these notions that are not really things that humans could conceive mentally, which is interesting because perhaps these things that we've now created mathematics to kind of explain are those concepts that as material forms we can't comprehend, but perhaps the soul or in the intelligible realm we would be able to understand. So I guess the thing that I find most compelling is that his concept of the eternal nature of the universe has not been, overturned, and that in his own way, and in this kind of more philosophical, spiritual, and ancient way, he's explaining things that could be interpreted as a more simplified or a different perspective on some of the same ideas we have now on the nature of the universe, which I think is cool.
Right. And these sort of discussions on cosmology are constantly evolving in the modern academy. I remember when I was a child watching the Discovery Channel and listening to the different discussions among physicists and cosmologists about Big Bang, Big Crunch, and they have all these different cosmological theories. And 100 years ago, obviously these theories didn't exist, and I kind of wonder 100 years from now, how will cosmologists and physicists understand the universe? Will it be in the same way as what we have now, or will it be something considerably different? But bringing it back to Plotinus, he's of course seeing things through the lens of somebody in his era in the ancient world, in the Greek world specifically. If you compare it to, for example, the Buddhists, they saw the universe as separate world systems. So you have Mount Sumeru and the four continents on top of a disc-shaped Earth. So they have a flat Earth cosmology. And their idea is that each of these different world systems exist independent of one another. And hypothetically, you can be reborn in this world or in another world.
So like a multi-universe idea? When you say different worlds, do you actually mean almost like different universes or realms of reality?
I think you could almost understand it as like different solar systems using modern
Okay.
terminology. But they're not they're not solar systems, they're Mount Sumeru systems, where at the center of the world is this giant mountain with the sun and the moon orbiting around it. But they believe that eventually you'll have this great conflagration that will burn up everything up to a certain point in the heavens, because above Mount Sumeru are the different heavens. And up to a certain point, there'll be like this, enormous cosmic fire. And there are certain beings at the sort of higher heavens that will be able to look down and witness it, but everything below it will be completely destroyed. And there'll be like this abyss, and then the first being who is reborn into this will be alone, and that will be Brahma. And then Brahma will witness the rebirth of the lesser gods in front of him, and they will look to him and they will see him as the creator god. And because he did not witness any other beings before him, he will ignorantly think that I am the creator god. And so
Interesting.
beings will think that he's a creator god, but eventually even Brahma, will die, maybe in this grand conflagration, and then somebody else will be reborn as the future Brahma in the future reborn universe. So
and and how are they born, or is it kind of a secular materialistic perception of how things come back into being?
No, it's like it's entirely based on this idea of karma, that actions lead to the formation of reality as we experience it. Like
so there's some sort of like metaphysical just like the forces of the universe, there's some metaphysical force that is perpetuating the cyclical recreation of reality, of physical reality.
Right.
Okay.
And it's in some of the Buddhist literature, it's framed as collective karma. So it's not one being's karma, but it's all of our karma collectively together creates this physical world that we're experiencing. But it has a beginning and an end, but it doesn't mean like eternity all end. It's not like an end of time forever and nothing exists ever again. It's just like a recurring cyclical cosmology. And so this is different from what Plotinus is proposing, where the universe is consistent and heavenly motions are perfect and orderly. But then at the sublunar realm, we have all of this various configurations of matter, air mixed with earth mixed with fire, and so forth. And because it's in flux, we're mortal.
That was interesting to me too. Sorry, but because like obviously his idea of elements is different than our current idea of elements, but he introduces the idea that all these elements kind of depend. The elements being fire, water, earth, they depend on each other to actually even exist. Not that it's exactly the same, but it kind of makes me think of the modern concept of compounds, where for things to exist, you need certain, like compounds of different elements together to actually, I mean, obviously elements can exist on their own, but the wide variety of things that we actually interact with are usually are compounds. They're not pure elements. Yeah, he that's interesting to me that he thinks that they're all interdependent, at least here in the sublunar realm, which is on a micro level kind of reflects the larger macro concept that he has, that everything is actually one thing or interconnected. I think I took that totally off of where you were going with this, but I found that because that is the argument he's making, right? That they, at least on Earth, for them to actually do what their actual function and how they can execute their function is to be dependent upon each other.
Right. So the fact that we can see things, we can see Earth, is dependent on fire. So there's also teleology there. And so, I mean, you could frame this cosmology also as a form of intelligent design, I think, because obviously the superlunar is created by the demiurge, and then the sublunar is created by the gods, which were created by the demiurge. And so all of this has a sort of teleology, a meaning, a significance behind everything.
So is his demiurge the same as the one? Because it seems like the translations or the concept of the demiurge is used by Plato. Because I think we've both looked into like what these terms have meant to different philosophers and how that sometimes creates confusion. Because early on, I mean, we've already established that everything is the one has always been, and everything is kind of outside of time. But the material world and the gods are emanations from the one of intelligences, and the gods, the planets, whatever in this case, are some of those intelligences, right? So I don't know if their creation is really intelligent design, if we stick to a more Neoplatonic concept of the one versus something like, I guess, like a Gnostic demiurge who not only is evil but is like sentient.
Yeah, that's a good question. So
But clearly we are, like, there is sentience in the intelligence of the gods to create the sublunar realm. My question is more, it seems like once you reach the level of the intelligences, everything above that is kind of this divine but natural, and like it's just like a natural order of things, and the natural order of things happens to have a divinity to it, but it's not sentient like the Judeo-Christian God or anything like that, or even some of the purely polytheistic gods.
I think from maybe a more occult point of view, trying to bridge the gap between how we perceive reality and how the gods would perceive it would be tremendously difficult, if not impossible, for a mortal, which is why speculating about how the gods would make their decisions and so forth, especially since they operate outside of time and space as we experience it, it would be very challenging, I think. I mean, you can rely on mythology to sort of, frame it in a narrative, but to kind of discuss it at like a, philosophical or a metaphysical point of view would be extremely challenging.
Well, I'm questioning more, not, I understand that, but I'm questioning not what the gods did or do, but that which they come from. Was that really a sentient decision? Is that really intelligent design, or is it just that part, the one, everything, at least as I've understood it up to this point, is that it is not a sentient thinking being, right? It's beyond our understanding, but it is not a sentient thinking being as we would conceive of it.
Right. And so the demiurge
planned anything. That is the nature of what it does. That is its nature.
Right. The demiurge in Timaeus, you can see figuratively exist before space and time, because the demiurge creates the stars and the planets and sets them in motion with luminosity, which is basically a figurative way to represent time. So, the demiurge exists before time and space. So there's basically this intelligence, if we want to call it an intelligence, that exists prior to space and time. And
but then seems synonymous with it seems to occupy the same space as the one does in Plotinus's philosophy, because it also creates the gods. Like it's not the same, but it occupies the same space. He also does say that Plato's, or Timaeus, starts off pretty much saying like, this isn't actually what happened, but rationally, this is like probably what happened, or as close as I can come up with, or an intelligent, logical person can guess at. Here's a guesstimate. And perhaps Plato was presenting it this way just to frame it within a way that a human could kind of understand, because the abstractions we're trying to grasp at right now in this conversation probably would not be easy for a person, for even a person now, but a person then to really understand. So maybe he was trying to anthropomorphize some of these aspects, which then Plotinus, perhaps much later, is rendering a little bit more abstract, or trying to get closer to what it might be, because he allegedly experienced some level of the intelligible realm, if we were to believe that he had these kind of moments of enlightenment or out of body experiences or what have you. So my understanding is that they're like different interpretations, different ways of presenting to people the cause of the same thing, the demiurge in Plato and the one in Plotinus.
Right. So the relationship between the one and the demiurge, I believe I've recalled reading some academic literature as well that tries to explain the difference between the two, because the demiurge is the principal creator figure in Plato's Timaeus, whereas, as we know with Plotinus, you link it back to Pohen, the one, but then the one is in a strict sense isn't the demiurge either, because it's more of like a monistic.
Yes, they're syncretic. They're like, they don't act. They're just like different. As if we were comparing different gods from different polytheistic religions. I know this is kind of, it's like trying to compare Jupiter with Odin. They may occupy some of the same spaces in their respective religions, but they're not apples to apples either. But they're not like in the same universe. You know what I mean? They're just like in their respective universes or philosophical concepts, they occupy similar spaces, but not identical spaces. That's how I kind of conceive of the relationship of these two. They're not interrelated actually within the same philosophical universe. They're just occupy similar spaces in their respective philosophies, but not identical, because there clearly is a difference in the way that Plato presents the demiurge it reads as a much more sentient being, and with some sense of morality, because he speaks of good in a more human way at certain points versus what good means in Plotinus and what the one is in Plotinus. But they fundamentally create things in a similar way, and then the emanations therefrom are similar, that they create the universe and the gods, and then the gods create humans and animals and stuff on Earth. And that I think in both instances, the Earth itself is a sort of divine form. Certainly in Timaeus, I remember in Timaeus, the Earth itself is a god in a sense, is Gaia, right? I mean, he doesn't call her that there, but he does speak that the Earth itself is a living divine entity.
Right, right. So my question on that point then is, having read this chapter, how would you read it beyond just being a statement of cosmology, or a set of statements or ideas about cosmology? So if we accept, or at least take at face value, what Plotinus is saying about the sublunar and the superlunar realms, how does this help you in your own philosophy, your own way of life, your own way of approaching reality, for better or for worse?
Even though I think a lot of what he's saying is empirically wrong, I think that it points to a syncretic, or maybe syncretic's not the right word, but an integrative, the integrative nature of what I believe might be a reality, where aspects of the metaphysical and their function and maybe the destiny for why they are the way they are, when we're speaking of the divine planets or the gods, and the science that we are slowly uncovering empirically, or like, I guess, the reality of the material world as we experience it and can investigate it empirically, are tied together. It's integrative. They're not separate, and they don't have to be mutually exclusive. And I think just like the intelligible forms and the one, they are just higher levels of which the material world is a manifestation of. I think that is how a lot of the spiritual and metaphysical and the empirical, or the material, interact. That a lot of things can be explained by science, but that doesn't mean that it's still not just an expression of something higher. And I think that, and to me, I think, and this is not necessarily anything having to do with Plotinus's theory, it's just my personal, not belief, but sensation or feeling that I guess you could, it approaches more of like a Jungian concept of collective unconsciousness, but it's not quite that either. Just that certain truths that with much difficulty, much complex science, and hundreds of years we've figured out now, somehow on some basic level understood by people thousands of years ago. I think there's some inherent truths of reality that for whatever reason humans kind of know. And then we eventually can figure out, we can substantiate it empirically, or even figure out the material mechanism behind it. And you see this in a lot of different religions. You see this in Buddhism. You see this as far when it comes to cosmology, certain, almost it seems like big notions that humans intuitively understood or knew, then are explained later through science and are consistent enough. Why? I think that's fascinating. I guess the intelligent design, or the harmony, or the fate of how things are all interconnected. Perhaps we are so intuitive of certain things, are later substantiated because we are embodied souls. We are part of everything. And so some glimpses of true truth with a capital T come across even before our material mortal beings have the capacities to investigate it materially. That I think is very fascinating, and I think is if you read this carefully, that's kind of evidenced here.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, when I look at this, I guess with my training in Buddhism, I'm reminded of the principle of impermanence, and that, although Plotinus doesn't say this explicitly, that, well, we are in the sublunar realm, and therefore we are mortal, and we're subject to decay and the eventual process of disembodiment of the soul from the material body, and therefore we should make the most out of our present life. And that kind of goes back to the earlier chapter where he says that you shouldn't terminate the life process prematurely because you still have room for growth. And so if we accept that in the sublunar world we're subject to all of the challenges and the inevitability of old age, sickness, dying, and death, then we should probably make the most out of our time that we have as embodied beings. And I guess there's a sort of, optimism that one can take from that as well, that you can look up to the stars and you can see something that is perfectly ordered, well, from his point of view, and eternal, setting aside that modern science has different theories about the longevity of the sun and the solar system and so forth.
But even beyond that, your point still holds true, because beyond looking at the stars, you still remember that you're inside or a part of this large universe, which may be eternal in some way. Either it is eternal in a constant, consistent way, or even if it cycles through, not similar to, but kind of recalling the Buddhist concept you brought up earlier. If there is a big bang and then a big crunch and then a big bang and a big crunch, it's still an eternal cyclical nature of internal flux, but fundamentally everything together is eternal. It changes, but it never disappears. It persists in different forms. We persist in different forms, even after death.
Right. I mean, even from a strictly materialist point of view, too. I mean, I'm just a little clump of biomass with a spark of consciousness walking around for X amount of years, which in terms of cosmic time is absolutely nothing. So, and if I understand that individuality and a sense of self is all a very sort of subjective imposition on this little clump of matter walking around the surface of the earth for a few years, with a spark of consciousness, then fundamentally I am just an extension of the biomass on planet Earth, and the biomass
which is still living, though, because
right.
So I started composting and really studying soil lately. So even if you're cremated, whatever you end up doing, if you end up in the soil, dirt, you know what dirt is? Dirt is when your house is dirty. The moment you take all that stuff, if it's biodegradable at any level, and you throw it outside, it eventually becomes soil. And soil is not dead. Soil is living. It's made out of bacteria, parasites, fungus, all sorts of things. And together it's its own biome, and it creates things. It creates plants. It creates the things we eat. It feeds the animals we eat. These micro living things eventually become us again. Even us now living are not made up of just dead meat. We are millions of bacteria and fungus that are influencing us constantly and are influencing our moods and our consciousness. So even in that sense, even as you said, in a completely materialist sense in which, there's no soul that survives, in some way, even after you're dead, your mass will continue to persist and in some way find its way into sustaining and becoming other sentient beings of one level or another, maybe a bird, maybe another human.
Well, this leads to another kind of question that is like, is there one sentient being, Jeff, or am I just a society of cells, fungi,
Oh yeah,
bacteria?
well now we're going into like biology. That's evolutionary biology, and I mean microbiology, gut biology, neurobiology, yeah. But that's again, and even that, like going back to what I was saying, all of that can be true and still just the material expression in which the soul has to present itself here. I think a lot of what people call supernormal, paranormal events or realities, for them to be perceived by the senses in this realm, they must manifest themselves in a way that makes materially consistent with the physical rules of the material realm. But that doesn't mean that their causality or relationship to something beyond the material doesn't exist.
Right. I mean, in certain occult thinking as well, it's not that, for example, your spell work directly influences another person in like you would see in the movies where you summon a gale storm or a fireball or something like that, or levitation, but rather you're working through for intelligent forces behind the scenes and commanding them to your will, and then you're basically manifesting, or you're affecting other people through a sort of back corridor of reality. So you're basically summoning spirits, binding them, and compelling them to exercise influence on other people's consciousnesses, and then forcing those people to do your will, or affecting a sort of society of people.
Right. And perhaps those daemons or other entities that exist in the, I am assuming, like the intelligible realm, then to have that effect in the material world must somehow manipulate material things, right?
But yeah,
To
that
have
goes.
an effect on you. I mean, this is me just guessing, like maybe for them to be able to have an effect on another person, say a negative effect, it's really some unknown to us, some occult manipulation of like the body chemistry of this person,
Well,
as an example.
this actually goes back to Plato, where Diotima is speaking to Socrates and explains that the gods themselves never descend into the material world. That's why we don't see them directly,
Mhm.
but rather it's the daimons who act as intermediaries between the gods and humanity. And so, taking from that point, occultists, magicians in the past believed that you could basically manipulate, bind, and compel the daimons to do your bidding for you. And you also see similar things in like Egyptian magic as well,
Right.
where you're working with spirits primarily. And
A bit arrogant on the part of humans that they think they can influence something that is usually controlled or influenced by the gods. But
well, in magical thinking, like for example, in some cases, you bind the spirit and then you use the name of their boss to compel them. You basically say, in the name of
like
such and such a
emailing them
god.
and saying, your boss told me you need to go do this thing, and they're not going to go check. They're just going
Well, the idea is that the diamonds are very single-minded entities that
right,
are easily controlled
right.
and compelled. And that, I think, also, like when you read Iamblichus as well, there's sort of references also to wild spirits, which kind of seem to me almost like rogue diamonds, where like it's
Oh,
like,
like demon devils
well,
by
I
Christian
guess you could,
standards,
you could qualify them as demons as you would
or
understand them.
jinn.
Jinn are still different, yeah. I mean,
Jinn are similar to daemon in some ways. I mean, there's good jinn, there's bad jinn.
well, I mean, the jinn have free will like humanity.
Right, exactly.
The angels are compelled by
Ah,
God,
right.
whereas the jinn have free
What
will.
about, and the daemon are compelled by the gods.
But it sounds in like Iamblichus and also in magical treatises in later periods that the daimons, some of them do develop free will, and whether that's an error in creation, like it's a bug in their programming and they go rogue and they get to do what they want,
Well,
or
I think perhaps, but I think more likely is that Iamblichus and later writers are now being influenced or learning different cultures' concept of somewhat similar things and are starting to integrate different ideas. The difference between something like the medieval, or not the medieval, I'm sorry, the Middle Eastern jinn, which existed even before Islam, or some manifestation of that existed, or the Judeo-Christian concept of angelic beings, and then the Greco-Daemons and wherever they came from, all these different ideas of, or the Nuna, as time goes by, these different thinkers are pulling from different ideas. And I think they're probably thinking through these things and thinking what is more likely or not more likely, and kind of amalgamating some of these ideas. So nothing's ever apples to apples, but there is similarities between these different perceptions. And we don't really know. I mean, the reality is we don't know. We don't know that it's exactly one way or the other.
well,
We
the
only
other
know, if you
also,
believe in any of this at all, you only know that, well, if I do this thing, this happens. And I've had some sort of experience where I've sensed this kind of entity, and then everything else is just hypotheses.
in the case of Iamblichus, he practiced theurgy, which you could qualify as a form of magic, and
Right.
from his perspective, it was actually possible to bind these spirits or these daimons.
Right.
And
But I mean, the rest of their nature, we don't know. He only knew he could do that. He doesn't really know if they have free will or not, or all the rest of it. He doesn't. I mean, but
well,
these,
it's
different,
a matter of inference, I suppose, where
yes,
in some cases the diamonds are doing as they're told according to
yeah.
divine will, and then in other cases you're encountering rogue spirits that apparently have free will.
And who knows how many different kinds of entities or whatever there are, right? And I guess, yeah, I guess it makes sense. Like just because it makes me think of actually Pico della Mirandola and his On Dignity of Man, and how he opens the book to kind of make man not seem as this like horrible, pathetic, sinful thing that he was seen in medieval Christianity, but kind of like, look, the fact that we have this free will, even though we're materially embodied, and he's coming from a Christian perspective, even though, you know, he studied all this other stuff too and was clearly influenced by it. He almost said that even the angels would be envious of humans because we have free will. We have the choice to be almost basically to behave in a manner to raise us to a level of divinity, or choose to be really crappy and squirm on the ground like worms. Whereas the angels have no choice, kind of like the sort of daemon that you were describing, that are single-minded and can only follow the direction of either the angels of God or the daemons of different kind of polytheistic gods or higher level entities. So yeah, I mean, that does clearly they're just existing in a different realm without a material essence. That doesn't necessarily mean they're in every way better than us, right? They're just different, and so to us, it's kind of crazy, and they may appear better. I don't think that's necessarily the case. And I think there's different types of daemons, perhaps.
Well, there's from my experience of listening to modern magicians and reading some of the literature on this, there's such an existential gap, for example, between humans and daimons, that for daimons to experience space and time as we experience it, it's a great thrill, which is what can happen when people are possessed by them, is that basically the daimon gets a taste of reality as we know it. And for them, living in a flesh and blood vessel in a material world, subject to time, is quite a thrilling experience, because existentially it's extremely different from what they're accustomed to. But conversely, for a human to experience reality through the eyes, the figurative eyes of a daimon, through their
or just through immateriality, like out of body experience or something.
Out of body experience, and also being outside of the normal framework of time and space, is quite a thrilling experience. So
yeah, I guess that's my point.
Right, there's a massive existential gap.
The grass is always greener on the other side of the dimension.
Right, that's a good way to frame it. And so this kind of ties it back to what Plotinus is talking about, is that there's the sublunar world, which is what we're accustomed to, and then there's the super-lunar realm.
Right.
And we'll read the rest of the book and see what he says.
Well, he continues, it kind of builds on this. The next few chapters, he kind of talks about the motions of the planets, and then on fate and other things, if the stars have, then I think he kind of gets into things approaching astrology. But yeah, that's a good way of thinking about it, that perhaps even though he's like materialistically incorrect in the superlunar levels being eternal, perhaps in a purely metaphysical way, they are. The superlunar actually being the realm of, say, daemons or other entities, to include perhaps, in a sense, I guess, even the planets, because the material of which they're made is the will continue even after they're no longer what they are, and will become something somewhere else. I don't know. I guess that's kind of like us. But yeah, maybe on a purely metaphysical level, what he's speaking as supralunar is really just what by today's standards we might call like another dimension, or the dimension in which these entities exist. Different deities.
I mean, I think if you were to try to transmute it into modern terminology, it would basically be the eternal laws of physics and the forces that govern the universe.
Yeah.
Like the constants of gravity and energy and that sort of thing. Yeah.
Yeah. And I agreed with that part, because he kind of then sums it up in that being the nature of the entire universe. But even that, like, it's there's one of the things I was reading about when I was like brushing up on some of the physics stuff was, that they think 95% of the universe is dark energy and dark matter, and they don't even know what that is. And that this thing, what is it called? The Hubble constant, which was the way that they were with the Hubble telescope. They were, I don't know, maybe it was Hubble's, maybe it was like a formula. I don't know, but they're able to see how far, and I think it is because of them. They were using the telescope, but they're able to see how quickly objects in space, or galaxies or planets, stars, are moving away. And they've noted that it hasn't been consistent. It was slower, and then it's now exponentially moving faster. And they think that perhaps they don't know why or how that dark energy somehow has an effect on slowing down and making faster the expansion of the universe. So this whole constant that they've been working on may not even be correct, because they admit that there's laws of physics that may be out there that they have no idea about yet. So yeah, I
Well,
mean, everything's a freaking mystery, which is
mean,
what makes things fun.
right. I mean, science is falsifiable, so that means you can prove it wrong, and that's how
Yeah.
it proceeds with growing and evolving,
Right.
ideally towards a more accurate framework and body of knowledge. So, anyways, so if you don't have any further comments, then we can wrap things up.
No, yeah, I think we've covered all of it.
Good.
So we'll talk about the universe from Plotinus's perspective a little bit more next time.
Okay. Thanks so much. We'll see everybody next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.